On the workbench today is this lovely Samick Model SA11TS, made in Indonesia. They're asking $50 on Craigslist. The ad said it had the jack replaced a year ago, and I haven't played it since then, and I don't have an amp to test it out. So I said, I'll give you $30 for parts. I don't need to test it out. Now that I got it home, it's time to test it out. That's definitely not sounding quite right. I've seen something similar to this before on a guitar that simply wasn't grounded. But if I touch the wire or I touch the claw, makes the same noise, I know it's a good solder. So the black wire is the ground that goes to the claw, and it's connected to the strings and everything else. The gray wire contains both the positive and the negative that connect to the jack. The positive goes to the main volume. After the signal goes through the master volume, it goes to the switch, which is the pickup selector. We've got the tone pot. That's just a parallel circuit. Since I didn't find anything here, next maybe there's a bad solder at the jack. Now looking at the jack, I see a problem. So what we've got here is the positive white wire on the terminal where the negative should be. And the negative is touching the tip of the cord, which is positive coming from the amp. So I'll reverse these and see if that solves the problem. Soldering iron's hot. Nice. Negative on negative. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll screw that back on and I'll try it out. It's not in tune, but that's how it's supposed to sound. Oh. Rusty switch. There might be a little corrosion on the switch. So you can see the sweep move as I move the switch. I can see lines of corrosion built up here. So it definitely would be a problem. You can see this just needs to be cleaned up. I'm going to use a little piece of scrubbing pad. I put it in an alligator clip so I can reach in there. The jack is sounding good, the pickup selector's working. So from playing it for a minute, I mean, the first thing I want to do is adjust the action at the saddles and try and get it as low as possible. So I just take my little Allen wrench to get the action at 1/16 of an inch or 4/64. And there's no buzzing on the highest frets. Looks like I have at least one low fret. So I'm going to do a little fret work. The first thing though, I'm going to adjust the truss rod. I'm probably just leave it right in the middle so that the truss rod can be tightened or loosened in the future should that be needed. Before I took the strings off, the neck was pretty nice and straight. Where I found it is tightened all the way. But I am going to loosen it just a little bit before I level the frets so that there's at least a little room to tighten it. But I usually want the neck to get at least a little bit of bow to take the strings all the way off. So I'm just going to use a twist tie to get them out of the way. Clean off the fretboard. Put a tiny bit of dish soap on. Just get the gunk off there. Wipe the soap off with regular water. And then dry it with a towel. I think this fretboard could use some oil. Everything's clean, so I'm going to mark the frets with a marker. Then I'm going to make a first pass, see exactly how low the low one is. By looking at where the marker rubs off, I can see which ones are too low, which ones are too high. Although I already knew from playing, I can see while I'm leveling the frets that this fret is too low, but the file's not touching this fret. I'm gonna get all of the higher up frets level with this low one, and then I'll level the rest of the fretboard. Just very gently until it starts taking marker off the low fret. So the low fret is actually, it's only like a fraction of a millimeter. All of the frets closer to the pickups are leveled now, so I'll gently begin all the rest of the frets. Now I'll put more marker on it again. Then I'm gonna get the strings tuned up again and put a little string lifter next to the nut. The strings will be in tune but lifted above the frets enough for me to get this fret file under the string. It's all tuned up. Basically, you just slide one side under, slide the other side under the other string, and then just level the frets like you would with no strings. So make sure that your lifter is high enough. You don't want your file to pinch between the string and the first fret, because if it's pinching and it takes down that first fret lower than the other frets, you'd have to take down all the other frets to match the first fret if you make that fret too low. So I don't have much more leveling to do at this point. That immediately looks level. This neck is actually pretty darn straight. All the marker is removed. That means the frets are level. It's time to crown the frets. Now, mark the frets again. I want the marker thick and dark this time. Crowning the frets with a crowning file kind of reminds me of brushing my teeth. I want the frets to have a nice narrow ridge at the top. So I go along each side of the fret from top to the bottom. Be careful not to scratch the fretboard. It's pretty easy to feel once you've got a good ridge, because instead of feeling a little slippery or catching, there's a nice even friction all the way along the fret. Now we'll do the right side, top, middle, and bottom. Now if I zoom in, you can see how there's a shiny brass stripe on one side, the remaining red stripe in the middle, and a shiny brass stripe on the other side. That means it's crowned. Now I got a couple dozen more. Once I've got the frets crowned, I'm gonna get the fret file out again and make sure that the fret ends are 100% flush with the edge of the fretboard. These frets are actually not too bad, but I want to make sure that they're the best they can possibly be. Then I'm going to roll the fret end so it's smooth and round like half a ball bearing at the end. Next step, with the frets leveled, crowned, the edges flush and the edges rolled. Before I polish the frets, I'm going to prep them for polishing by just using a very fine scrubbing pad. Going over the fretboard and the frets. No ends should be catching any fibers. The final step to polishing the frets is to get some super fine steel wool. You don't have to polish it hard at all. When it's polished, it'll get real shiny and smooth. It'll gleam like a mirror. I got the frets nice and level and smooth, and then I lowered all the saddles to try and get the action as low as I can. But I take it down all the way and it's about the perfect height. I've already got the truss rod adjusted right where I want it. So my only option here is to insert a shim and raise the neck up closer to the strings. Then I can put the saddles about in the middle of where they're adjusted. That should be the perfect height with a lot of room for adjustment. I've loosened the strings, now I'm going to take the neck off. Let's see, what's it look like in here? It's not all nice and neat and clean, but it's not terrible. About what I'd expect. So I'm just going to use a razor blade to make it totally flat and smooth. I'm going to use some very dense cardboard to make the shim. I'll put it halfway into the neck pocket so I can precisely measure the width on the other side. Cut it out, there'll be a nice snug fit inside the neck pocket. And I'll screw in the screws just a little bit, just enough to poke holes. I'm going to cut off the excess with a razor blade again. Put a couple strips in there to help get that action low. It is definitely too low now, so I'm gonna raise up the saddle. So we'll use this Allen wrench. The strings are a little bit high over the first fret, which means the nut slots are just a little bit too high. I'm going to start by filing the low E. Aside from getting the height right, I want to make sure the break angle is right and that there's a nice smooth groove in there. I'm going to file till there's just a little bit of dust, then I know I've taken off a little bit of height. You can use your files as feeler gauges for the height, or you can use a string as a gauge. That's all good. Now it's time to adjust the saddles again. This time though, I'm gonna adjust the intonation. I'm gonna move them back and forth by adjusting these screws with a screwdriver. Now I've got my E string basically tuned up. It's just maybe a tiny bit high. So it's almost even on the high side a little bit. Now I'll play the low E string on the 12th fret. This should also be almost in tune, but just a little bit too high. The E string, the octave's in tune too. Now the harmonic. Good. That's good too. Yeah, they match, so I know the intonation is basically good. Okay, the A string's almost perfectly in tune. It's a little bit low. One octave up on the same string is exactly in tune, but it should be a little bit low. So to lower this note, to make it match, I want to make the string length longer, right? Because a longer string length is a lower note. So to make the string longer, I move this saddle backwards. So to move this saddle backwards, I make the screw tighter and I screw in the screw. I turn the screw about 360 degrees. I've got the A string in tune. It's going a little bit below and a little bit above. It's perfectly in tune. And on the 12th, a little below, a little above. Okay, now that I've got the strings intonated, now the final step to giving it a complete setup is to raise up the pickups. I want them to be as high as they can get without the strings ever touching them, so it doesn't make noise while I'm playing. If they're too loud, you can always lower them. Or if you feel like one of the pickups is too trebly when you're playing it, you can lower the treble side or the bass side and get a nice even sound. Then you've got it all set up. Just when I thought I was almost completely done with everything, I noticed something a little funny. This little crack in the neck pocket that I was almost totally sure it was just a little crack in the finish and not in the wood, seems to have gotten bigger, which tells me it's a crack in the wood. So there's only one thing to do really. Is make the crack just wide enough that you can get glue in there. You get it full of glue and clamp it down, let that dry. If I can pull that off, it should be as strong as new. Just when I thought I was almost completely and totally done, I noticed this little crack in the neck pocket here that I thought was just in the finish had gotten a lot bigger. That means it probably is a crack in the wood in the body, not just in the finish. And as I try and pry it apart and pull it back, I can see if I really try and pry it apart, I can see the crack get just a little bit wider. So yeah, I know that there is a crack in the body, and that needs to be stabilized either by, now that I've got the guitar clamped down, how bad is this crack in the wood? It's just a matter of getting glue into this crack. Using this knife and another little wooden shim, When I feel sure that every possible surface is well coated with glue on this side, I'm going to use the same sliver to try and brush in some glue as deep as I can, and do that a few times. Well, I just get as much as I can in there, and then I'll take out the knife and get under there, put the knife back, get under the shim, take them out and clamp it. Now every time I try to add more glue, I'm pushing out the glue that's already in there, so it's full. So now when I take the knife out, I can see glue squeezing out all up and down the seam of the crack. Now when I take the knife out, I'm going to clean it off and clamp it. And I'll put a clamp on there, just so there's good firm contact. Don't want to squeeze out all the glue. And I'll give that 24 hours to dry. It's been the full 24 hours. Yeah, this is about as hard as I can try to pry it apart without hurting my hands. It's totally solid on both sides. I'll put the neck on and give it some rough playing, and then check it out again after I play it. Before I could test it out, I broke a high E string, of course, so what the heck. Let's put a new pack of strings on there. It's really the finishing touch to any setup. New set of strings. I like to wind it so that it's wrapping downward, and when it gets tight, it's kind of low on the post. I always like to clip off the excess and then go in with needle nose pliers so I can grab the very tip of this string end with the thin part of the pliers. Just wind it around a few times. The sharp tip is pointed straight down at the top of the post. It's not going to scratch up any case that it's in, and it's not going to poke anyone. It won't poke or scratch you. The body is one of the nicer parts of this guitar because it's so light.